All right, we really don't have that much to cover. I'm on page 574, and we're not going to do the last section today. We'll do that tomorrow, and we're going to go up to 589. So we got about 15 pages or so. All right. So some of the stuff that's in here you've already heard about. Some of it you have not. All right. Notice it says once you've created a data source, you can bind controls. Well, that's the whole idea behind this. All right. And doing it the easier way, as we did yesterday, you saw that it automatically created something that looked like this for you. So in other words, not only could you view any record, but you could add a record, delete a record, and you could go in and update a record too. All right. And ideally, anytime you click the disk icon, it would save your changes. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. Now you'll notice here, this looks different, this picture, from what we did yesterday. Because what we did yesterday was we dragged out each control that we wanted right onto the form here. You don't have to do that. Now, when we did the project earlier today, we did not do what the author refers to in here as complex data binding. All right, we did, but we didn't do it directly. If we've got this stuff here, but we go to our toolbox and drag out a data grid view, complex data binding automatically takes place. What I mean by that is the system says, oh, this control has got to be responsible for more than one field that's in our table. And in this case, it's responsible for every field. All right, and that's what they're mentioning on the previous page. Again, I've said this before, I don't want to read to you, but that's what they're talking about. All right, now look at this. They give an example, and they say in the next chapter, you'll learn how to bind a combo box control. Now, you might say, big deal. Think about this. Right now, if we bring up that products table, I don't even think I still have this thing running, do I? Yes, I do. All right. So if I select star, oops, try to run it again. And I come in and I say select star from products. Okay, you already know what this is going to look like. We already talked about this. But when the person is adding a new product, right now we've got 6 categories. That's not terrible. I think you'd agree with that. You're all smart enough that you could memorize that 1 is bikes, 2 is wheels type of thing. I think you could all do that. But what if you had 600 categories? Maybe you're that good. I sure as heck am not. But wouldn't it be nice if we went in and we wanted to add a new product that when it came to the category, instead of putting the ID in there, we had a drop-down list, and that drop-down list would show us those 6 categories. And we could just pick one. And it would automatically populate that with the correct category ID. All right. Not only would that be a better thing to do, that's pretty much how it's done. All right. So that's what we're going to be looking at getting into very shortly. Because right now, when you think about it, we have not been concentrating on add, update, and delete. I'm not saying you can't do that with what we've done so far, but we've been concentrating on the select statement. Okay. So again, the author says when you dragged out a table onto a form, okay, it says if you drag a table from the data sources onto the form, what does that mean? That means literally you grab one of those tables and drag it out there. All right, it'll go and it'll automatically add the grid view. And again, as mentioned, complex data binding, because one control, the grid view, is responsible for all of the fields in the table, regardless of how many fields are in there. Now, if you've got 20 fields, it's going to be very hard to show that. Okay? One thing that this differs from what we looked at before is by default, when you do that, it's going to show every field in the data grid view. All right? Whereas what we did yesterday, when we put it out there ourselves, we could pick and choose if we wanted to do that. All right. It says here, when you generate a data grid view object, Visual Studio automatically adds 5 additional objects. First is the data set object, which, as mentioned, defines the data set. In this case, it's the products table. It's the data that you're going to want to show. Second, the table adapter. Notice that's a table adapter, not a data table adapter. They're similar, but not identical. All right. So it says, second, the table adapter object provides commands that can be used to work with the product table. All right. What do you mean commands? That's the insert, the update, the delete. All right. Third, the manager provides for the writing in 2 or more related tables to the database so that referential integrity is maintained. You go, what the heck is a referential integrity? That's what I explained to you at the beginning. When you cannot remove a parent record when you have child records that depend on it. That's referential integrity. Now, what makes it bad? You can violate referential integrity. But when you violate it, you basically have to let the system know that you're violating it. So, in other words, what you're saying is, I'm about to kill the parent. What do you want me to do with the kids? Okay? One thing you can do with the kids is you can kill them too. Okay, so if I remove a category, all those products I just automatically remove. Okay? And that may be a very good option. If I remove a category, I can set the ID of all the other ones to null. That's pretty dangerous. You've got to make sure if you do that, that's like saying I'm switching these into another category. All right, that you want to make sure that you immediately run another query against that so that you set it up again. All right, those are the 2 things that are done the most often with referential integrity. You either, like I said, if you get rid of the parent, you automatically get rid of the child records, or you set whatever that was that the child records are depending on the parent to null. All right. Okay, it says fourth, there's a binding source object that specifies the data source the controls are bound to. Finally, it defines the toolbar. All right. Now it says here, and this is what I mentioned, but I'm trying to be complete here. It says the table adapter object is similar to the data adapter, but it can only be created by a designer. What the heck is that? That's the last part of the chapter that we talk about, and we will talk about it tomorrow. All right. In addition, it says it has a built-in connection and it can contain more than one query. That's what we're going to start to get into, like I said, next week already. All right. So the author says, I also want to mention you shouldn't have trouble figuring out how to use the binding navigation toolbar. It says you may want to know if you click the add button and then decide you don't want to do it, you can't immediately click delete. Because basically it would put the system into purgatory and it won't allow itself to be put there. So it says there's no way to cancel out of it. So what you want to do is if you've got a record that you didn't mean to put in, you put it in anyway, then you delete it. Does that make sense? So you can't do something midstream is what they're saying here. All right. It says because of that, you may want to add a button to the toolbar that provides this function. That's what we learn later. All right. So again, here's the controls. If you don't like my explanation, okay, there's the book's explanation of each control and a description of them. But you should be able to understand the idea of binding. All right. We've done it. We did a direct binding when we went through our example yesterday, when we did the data bindings.add and we bound each field individually. That was a simple data binding. Using the data grid view is a complex data binding. All right. So this is what they have in the book. So it says a product maintenance application that uses a data grid view control. All right. Now it says this figure presents the code that Visual Studio generates for you. You know what? You've already seen this because this is very simple to the similar to the example we did. In fact, when you look at it, all right, that pretty much is the same code that we looked at. All right. Anytime you let the software implicitly create something for you and you do absolutely nothing with it yourself, you are giving up a little bit of control. That doesn't mean you can't go back in. They're going to show this in just a minute, and it's also something that we did. We did this yesterday. If you remember, I didn't use every one of those labels. All right, I combined like the city, state, and zip into one label, got rid of the label for the state and for the zip. We took some fields and we made them bigger or smaller. There's other things as we start to get into the designer that you can do as well. You can format fields so that if they're currency, that they have, they're in a currency format. That if they're not currency, but if there's something that's a decimal type of thing that's not necessarily currency, but a double, you can say how many decimal places you want. And there's other things that you can do too. All right. Some of them are very aesthetic in nature as far as changing colors and the like. I mean, you can go nuts with this stuff. Maybe you've seen this kind of thing, that if something is a negative number, you might put it in red, or you might put the background in red or something like that to show it. All right. So as it says, Visual Studio automatically generates the code form above when you drag the data source onto the form. All right, the rest of the stuff I think we've all talked about in here. Oh, one thing I didn't mention to you guys, and I should have, if you look on the screen, I don't think we put this in. I'm glad that program is still up. One thing we're never doing is closing the connection. So really in exit here, I should have come in here, and before I did this, either right here, say con.close, which is totally fine to do. We did that yesterday. Or again, I can, and I'll do it this way, just a little to be a little bit different here. But I'm going to go in here, and in my form here, all right, I can go and find the form closing event. And I know it's in here. Maybe I'm not choosing the form. I don't know. There it is. All right. So form closing. Again, you don't want to put it into form closed. Then it's already closed. But I'm going to, typically, if you're going to name these yourself, you use the name of the form. So FRM SQL query tester. And then you put in underscore and the event name. So form closing, like that. Can everybody see what I did here? I put in this name. So then I can come in and say here, say con.close. There's debate over which is the best way to do a lot of this stuff and where do you put it. So I'm just showing you both. Not because I want to deluge you and put you a ton of things. It's just you will see both. All right? So I'll leave it like that. But I should have shown that before, because in one place or the other, we should have closed the connection. All right. Now, one thing we didn't talk about, look at this. When you use a data grid view, you can click on the column heading, and it'll automatically sort all records by that heading. If you click a second time, it should sort it in descending order. All right. Just kind of nice, because it's something, again, that you get in this case without doing anything yourselves. I don't know if you agree, but I think that's a nice thing. All right. How to change the controls associated with the data source? Well, again, this is what we talked about before. So notice when you click here, look up on the screen, it says you can either choose data grid view or you can choose details. Now, we didn't look at this yesterday. We just had all of our fields right here and we started to drag them out, right? Had we clicked the down arrow here, we could have chosen data grid view. Then clicked on that, bam, it would have filled it with a data grid view. All right. Now that can be a very quick way to basically set up an entire application. But again, as I've mentioned to you, with the system doing everything, there's still work that you've got to do. And we're going to talk about some of that in just a minute with some of the way the try catches, etc., that you'd be responsible for. So if you don't like doing it like that, then you choose details. And if you choose details, you get what we got. That's what you get by default. Also, notice in here, if you click on any of these, Notice they used state and they used a combo box there. That might make a lot of sense, right? Okay. But like I said to you, well, wouldn't it make sense for like the ID, the category ID, if we had the category name in there instead? We'll talk about how to do that. All right, probably more next week. But again, you can read this stuff. There's a lot of really good material in this book. I'm trying to go over what I consider to be the most important. I'm sure I miss things, not on purpose, but I'm just sure I do. All right. So again, how to generate detailed controls from a data source. This is, again, pretty much what we did. Okay, I don't think there's anything here. Again, they call it simple data binding. Notice to disable the adding, deleting, or updating of rows, you can remove the buttons from the toolbar. And they'll talk about that in Chapter 19. Not only can you remove the buttons that you get, you can add your own buttons to have it do whatever the heck it is you want it to do. All right? And again, we're going to get into all that stuff. It says when you drag individual controls to a form, don't drop them at the top of the form. If you do, the toolbar will overlay the first label. It just becomes a pain in the butt to do it. All right, so drag them down. What they're saying here is don't, when you put the first one in, it'll automatically create this stuff for you. When you start putting in your other controls, don't put them up here, is what they're saying. All right. And it's one of those things you say, well, what if I do? Well, the best way is to find that out is to just do it wrong on purpose. And then once you're screwed up and you've got to remove it and do it again, then you'll know why you don't do it that way. All right. So here's the one that uses text box controls. Notice what they have done. And again, I've mentioned this to you before. It's up to you. So it looks like this has got a gray background. So the customer ID is read-only status. The customer name and the customer address and the customer city, state, zip, they're all text boxes. And they're not read-only. So you should be able to go in and change any of those. So just like we did yesterday, they took those fields because originally when you dropped all this stuff in there, remember, this was dropped in, had 3 different labels, and each one was its own entity. It still is its own entity, but now we've got one label that we're using and we're sharing for all 3 of the fields. All right? All right. Now, this is the last part that we're going to go over today, just the last 4 or 5 pages. How to handle data errors. I started to show you some of those errors that you can get, but it's really hard to imagine every error that could possibly happen. I may have told you guys this before, but I just want to say it again because I thought it was interesting. Now, this is many years ago. My brother was a comptroller for an air filter corporation. They used this really weird operating system called PIC that I'd never heard of. And you've heard of that, like when you know, if you're a doctor and you go to a party and people find out you're a doctor, they go, hey, my arm hurts. What's the problem with it? Well, he always figured he could call me and ask me questions about the PIC operating system, and I just know what they were. I'd never heard of it before. All right, so I wasn't much help. But what happened to them was somebody was working right here in the office, and right above them, they had a big manual with PIC commands. They picked up the manual and they dropped it, and it hit the keyboard. When it hit the keyboard, it removed a bunch of customer records from their database. Now, they were fortunate and they backed up their data every day. So they were able to bring that data back. All right, but the point is, that's some kind of an error that you typically can't account for. You understand what I'm saying? All right, because who's going to think that's going to happen? Again, may have told you this story already, but I found it interesting. All right, my first class I ever taught, I was in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. All right, and I was teaching there, and their first program that they had to do, we'd had 2 tests and 2 assignments, but we didn't do any programming yet. It was all from the book. They had to add their points of their test scores together and the points of their assignments, and the whole thing was like 300 points. And then based off of that, 90 and up was an A, 80 and up was a B. We kept it simple. They had to figure out their current grade. Most people turned in theirs, and it worked, and they had anywhere from 5 to 15 lines. And I had one guy, no joke, because I counted 19 pages. He said, please try to break this program because I spent all weekend writing it and I've been trying to break it and I can't, and I couldn't. And I said, how did you find out how to do all this stuff? He said, I spent the weekend reading the manual. All right. But most people don't do that. Now, why am I even bringing that up? Because it depends on how important it is. If your data is compromised, what can it do to the company? If you lose a customer, all right, if Christopher there owns a company that I deal with, and he buys from me continuously, and he owes me $1 million, and somehow his record gets compromised where it says he doesn't owe me anything, all right, and he doesn't get a bill. And I don't mean to pick on him, but most people, they're not going to sit there and call you up and go, hey, did you know I owe you $1 million and I haven't paid it yet? All right. It's just the way that it is. So the author says when you develop an app that uses a data source, you'll want to provide code that will handle as many of at least the most common type of data errors that may occur. They break them down into 3 categories. Data provider errors. We'll talk about them in just a minute. ADO.NET or Active Data Object.NET errors, and errors that the Gridview control detects. Now, one of the things, the easiest one probably, not maybe to write, but to understand is with the Gridview. All right, if the Gridview is asking you, let's say that you've got category ID or product ID when we brought up the products table, and I leave it off or I put in hello, that's been defined as an integer field. I've just broken that. That's something that the data Gridview can detect. Because if I put that in and I click the save button, if it allows that to happen, I have now put a non-numeric value into a numeric field. All right. So it says when you access a database, there's always a possibility some kind of an unrecoverable error may occur. For example, the server may be shut down when you try to access it. That doesn't typically happen. In most companies of any size, their server will be running 24/7. All right, but it is possible, or the server could be down for maintenance. All right, stuff like that happens. Or as it says, the network connection might be broken. Okay, I don't know if you've all seen that commercial on TV. Well, I'm taping, it doesn't matter. The ones for Spectrum when they've got that woman who sits, I find her irritating. I don't know why, but I just do. But she goes, Spectrum has over 99.9% reliability. And that is good. I would vote for somebody, if somebody got 99.9% of votes, they'd win. The point is that 0.1% can be unbelievably important because when did it go down? Now, she mentions on there that you can even provide, for extra capability for when the internet goes down. I get all that. But if you don't do that and you're thinking, well, it's just 1/10 of 1%, what happens if that happens during regular time? All right. And again, it may not sound like a big thing, but I've always noticed, because I've had Charter for years, by and large, I'm happy with them. There's things I don't like. One thing is when it goes out, it's not always weather dependent, but it always goes out when I really want to watch something. A couple of years ago, I was watching the Packer-Bear game, and it went out for almost 2 hours. All right, and I wasn't happy, and neither was anybody in my neighborhood. Stuff happens. All right, so it says, Figure 813 shows the exceptions thrown by the .NET data providers for unrecoverable errors. These are the data provider errors. Some of these you won't have control over. You can't control, for example, in that first kind, if the server goes down, what can you do about it? All right, unless you're an administrator. Now, kind of interesting, you don't care, but I'm just going to tell you anyway. And Christopher's the only one who can see it. This big rack that's back here, behind that is their server. All right, the reason I'm telling you that, it's a white thing that's on the floor. And the reason I'm telling you that is Chad sent me an email last week saying that everybody was working from home and they were remoting into these computers and none of them were working. Somehow that thing got turned off. So all he asked was that I turn it on. Well, that was a pretty easy fix, right? All right, but it's not always that easy. When a server goes down, it may be a while before it comes back up. Now, how do you get around that? Well, if you're a company of any size, like an Amazon, if that server goes down, they've got other servers that immediately kick in. All right? But not every company can afford stuff like that. If you're a small mom and pop thing, you could be hosed. All right. So as it says, if you're using SQL Server like we are, you should catch SQL exception errors. Yeah, that should make sense. So it says the code in the example on the next page shows how you can catch an SQL exception that might occur when attempting to fill a data set using a table adapter. All right. So what does that mean? Well, here's, again, what they mentioned. Here's, as it says, some common members, but you're going to end up with quite a few try-catch blocks. Just remember that if you've got more than one catch, and I've said this before, keep saying the same stuff because it's important. The most specific error that you're trying to catch must come first. Then the next most specific error, then the next most specific error. The one at the bottom should be like exception. If you put that up at the top, it's going to catch everything. Now, usually the software will catch that and it'll flag it and it'll give you an error in your code that'll say that your other code's unreachable. All right. The other thing I wanted to mention back on this previous page, it says, although it's uncommon, more than one server error can occur as a result of a single database operation. In that case, any error object is created for each error. Why does that matter? Because if there's something wrong and you have to let a database administrator know, I don't want to call them and say, hey, Nicholas, can you tell me I've got this error? Can you fix it for me? And then realize that there's another error after we fix that, and then have to call them again a half an hour later. I want to say, hey, the following errors have been occurring, so they can both hopefully be fixed right away. All right. So again, they explain all this stuff. I'm not going to run into it and go over it again. All right. So how do you handle them? Well, the old joke is as best you can. Okay. It says when you work with bound data controls, ADO.NET errors can occur in those controls that are saved to the data set, not the database, or when an insert, update, or delete. That's what I gave you an example of. All right. It says constraint exception and no null allowed. Well, one thing, if you remember, all right, this was a while ago, but I want to show you. Let's see. I'm just going to grab, yeah, the schema should do. Did we allow anything to have nulls? Well, I think when you look through here, you'd agree, we allowed almost everything to be null. That's not the way it is every place. Now think about this. I'm not going to allow all those to be null in my customers table if I'm a real business. All right. I mean, I need your information. Same thing with employees. Same thing with vendors. Same thing with products. So the number of things that you're going to allow to be null are going to be very minimal. It's possible it'll be none. Now, when you look in here, the product description short and long, you might allow just to be, you might just say a short one's okay, must be in there, but the long one is no. All right, as an example. So that's something where that could be. But look at this. These can all be null. That's asking for all sorts of problems because that's what we're using the category ID, etc., to map up products and categories. I just kept it unbelievably simple, and I'm not going to lie to you, just in case my data that I put in was screwed up. All right, I just wanted to make sure everything would still run. But what I'm saying is this is not exactly reminiscent of, quote, real life, unquote. All right. So they go through an example. Let's just take a look at the example that they've got in here. So here's some of the things that can happen. All right. It says DB concurrency exception, the one that's thrown if the number of rows affected by this is 0. So I'm trying to do an insert and it doesn't work. So there's 0 rows affected, or an update or a delete, and it doesn't work. When you execute these, this is called an execute of a non-query. All right, I think I mentioned this the other day. It doesn't return any data. It should return the number of records that were affected, and that's it. All right. Data exception, it says the general exception that's thrown when an ADO.NET error occurs. Some of those, again, you don't have any control over. All right. Constraint exception, it's thrown if an operation violates a constraint. What's an example of that? If you've got a field that you say cannot be null, I mentioned that unique field the other day, and we talked about, for example, if you had a social security number and you had a rank and ID number, and neither one were going to be your primary key, but you might make them both unique. And if you make them unique, this is kind of an important point. A primary key cannot be null. Did you hear me? With unique, if I have 500 records in unique, one can be null. But only one can be null. You should always check for that. But let's say that I did have a null one in there already. Now I try to leave it null again for another one. That's going to be a constraint exception. All right. And then a non-null, a lot of these bleed into one another. All right. So it says common members in here. Well, you already know what the message is. We've already done that where we use ex.message. That's the system message. All right. And notice there's also a get type. That can be important because you can check the type of exception that you get. But again, all I'm trying to show you here is note the order of the catch statements. So we're saying that a DB concurrency exception is a more specific exception than a data exception, which is a more specific exception than the SQL exception. Also in here, and maybe this works with no problem, I was always told, don't give two exceptions the same name. All right, EX and EX, even though they're different exceptions. So I would have, I typically call mine here, I would call this something like DE for data exception. And this one I would call maybe SQLE for, something like that. All right, here they're not even giving it another name. All right, so again, you can read the stuff that's in here. All I'm trying to tell you is that you could have an application like this. This could go nuts. We could easily write a few thousand lines of code and bulletproof this thing. And you're bulletproofing it for things that are probably going to happen once, as the saying goes, in a blue moon. But again, if it happens and you haven't prepared for it, you're going to be hosed. All right. So the last thing that's in here, again, how to handle data errors for a grid view control. As it says, because the grid view is designed to work with data sources, it can detect some type of data entry errors. For example, it says, if the user doesn't enter a column that's required, or if you try to enter a new row with a primary key that's already exists, you'll get a data error event. All right, it says, and you can code for this. Then it says the second parameter has properties you can again use to display information. There's nothing in this is perfect. All right, all I'm trying to tell you is, it's easy to forget something. It's easy to screw something up. All right, so they're showing some examples in here. All right, and you'll notice this is not even in a try-catch right here. This is how you'd handle a data error. All right, so as it says, you can use the exception, the row index, the column index properties. Once you start digging your way into this, it's big, and there's a lot of stuff in here that can potentially be screwed up. All right, so tomorrow we're going to start right away, and there's not much left in this chapter. But tomorrow we're going to go over how to use the data set designer. And I showed you this a little bit yesterday, but the idea is, okay, here's all of your fields. Here's the method that you're running. But if you go into this XSD file, this XML schema definition file, you can go in and start making some changes. You can even build your own query. So we're going to hopefully at least look at that tomorrow. That's the plan at least. I haven't done any work with it yet. I'm going to try to, all right, this afternoon. All right. So again, I realize it's early, but if there are no questions, you got 2 hours. Now, I would tell you, you guys especially, this should be time if you're looking for something to do. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're gen ed stuff, that's fine. But if you're looking for something to do, start updating your portfolio, all right? And start thinking about how you're going to set up a portfolio. You know, if you've done very little to almost nothing on it, it should be pretty good. It's like 150 or 200 points. For you two, I would suggest that you at least watch that video that I'd shown you. It's not long, about 10 minutes. And then just download the product if you haven't and try it. We are going to look at it during the last week. All right, that's one of the things that I've got planned. You will have time that last at least Thursday and Friday to work on this. But when you get some time here, if you're looking for something to do, that's something you can at least start on. All right, so again, we'll pick it up tomorrow. And we've only got, what, 2, 4, 6, 8 pages left in the chapter. So I'll also be able to give you an introduction into Chapter 19 that we'll be covering next week. Also, please remember that tomorrow we will go over the written test for Chapter 18 as well. All right, questions? Yes.
Is there a hands-on test for this chapter?
There will, I don't even know if I'm going to give you any more hands-on tests, period. All right. My guess is if I didn't give you any more hands-on tests, that probably none of you would complain. All right. If we have any more hands-on tests, at the most, there'll be probably one more. All right. But if I don't give you one, and it means, for example, we can spend a little bit more time on link in the last week, I'd rather do that. All right. Anything else? All right.